Thank you so much for being here. My name is John Shaw, the director of the Simon Institute, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. It's an especially great pleasure to welcome a good friend of mine, Betty Koed, who is the U.S. Senate historian. She's been with the Senate Historical Office since 1998 and has been the Senate historian since 2015, is the first woman to ever be the Senate historian. Betty's background is maybe a little bit unconventional for holding such an august job. She grew up in Mason City, Iowa, went to high school in Colorado, started out in community college in California, then got a graduate degree and PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and has developed wide-ranging interests. She was telling me that in an earlier phase in her life, her interests were music and archaeology, and she plays the West African drum. She's the only Senate historian. We may have a concert after this. So, but Betty's she's helped me work on a couple of my books and has been really wonderful about reading them and giving helpful, constructive comments, but also gently worded. So she's a great resource at the Senate, is well known in the Capitol. You walk down the halls of the Capitol and you'll see her talking to senators and is well liked and well respected. So with that, I'd like to invite Betty to come forward.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, John, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here. One of my regrets as Senate historian is I never got to work with Paul Simon. He left a year before I came to the Senate, but I had long admired him and even voted for him a couple of times in presidential elections. So it's in some ways it helps me feel like I've had some connection to him now. So I'm really appreciative to be here, and thank you for coming out to listen to this tonight. As you can see from my title of my talk, I'm trying to decipher what makes a leader, what characteristics, what actions are required to earn the label of leader and bring someone into the realm of statesmanship. Defining leadership in the Senate usually brings to mind labels like majority leader and minority leader, president pro tem if you're a real insider. But those labels are a fairly modern tradition. In the Senate of 1820 or 1850 or even 1900, no one had the official title of majority leader. Now, of course, that's not to say there were no leaders before 1900. Throughout Senate history, many individuals have either assumed or been pushed into leadership positions, usually to solve a specific problem or to tackle a particularly difficult issue. Clicker. Before the Civil War, that leadership often came in the form of regional leaders. Kentucky's Henry Clay, for instance, a famous senator, represented Western and border state interests. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts looked out for the urban industrializing North. And John C. Calhoun of South Carolina was the spokesman for the agrarian slaveholding South. After the Civil War, men closely tied to big business became Senate leaders. By the 1890s, a group of senators known as the Senate Four, they weren't very creative with their titles in those days, Orville Platt of Connecticut, John C. Spooner of Wisconsin, William Boyd Allison of Iowa, who chaired appropriations for a record-holding 24 years, and Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island were the unquestioned leaders of the Senate. Bridging the gap from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era, the Senate Four had knowledge and expertise, and above all, they had power. In the early 20th century, party leaders like Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and Democrat John Worth Kern took charge. Now, as you can tell, in those days, the main prerequisite for leadership was really fancy facial hair. I did a whole talk one time on facial hair in the Senate, so. For a quarter century now, I've been studying Senate history in all of its complex glory, and sometimes lack of glory. And I've given a lot of thought to the concept of leadership. What characteristics often distinguish Senate leaders? First of all, and this may sound a little bit hokey, they must be committed to the ideal of a more perfect union. Perfection is unattainable, of course, but the pursuit of a more perfect union is what builds statesmanship. That often requires courage, the courage to stand up, to speak out, and to take action. even in the face of partisan and other political pressure. A leader is someone who has a vision, but is willing to listen, to compromise, to build a coalition of support, and to understand that great successes often begin with small accomplishments. And to be a true leader, to be a statesman, a person must have the capacity to place the needs of the nation ahead of personal gain or personal ambition. So it's not very complicated. All you need is commitment, courage, compromise, and selflessness. You got it made. I'll share with you today 3 case studies from Senate history, 3 examples of what I perceive to be true leadership. Let me begin with Henry Wilson of Massachusetts. Has anyone heard of Henry Wilson of Massachusetts? Raise your hand. No. 1? Not a surprise. Wilson is largely forgotten today, but he was an important and influential senator of the mid-19th century. Born in New Hampshire in 1812, Wilson endured a harsh childhood of indentured servitude. When he turned 21, he struck out on his own, settled in Natick, Massachusetts, and learned the craft of shoemaking. In 1836, Wilson visited Washington, D.C. as a tourist, and that trip transformed his life. It wasn't the grandeur of the city that caught his attention. It was the site of a slave auction taking place in the virtual shadow of the U.S. Capitol. From that moment on, Wilson was determined, as he noted, to give all that I have to the cause of emancipation. Henry Wilson's commitment to emancipation never wavered. He became active in the anti-slavery movement and quickly emerged as a powerful voice for reform. Freedom and slavery are now arrayed against each other, he declared in 1844. We must destroy slavery, or it will destroy liberty. Becoming a senator in 1855, Wilson proved to be an effective, hardworking, and dedicated statesman. During his 18-year Senate career, he guided military affairs and promoted the Transcontinental Railroad, but his influence was greatest in the realm of civil rights. Now let me pause for just a moment. For those of you who are familiar with this period of Senate history, the 1850s and 1860s, you might be wondering, why Henry Wilson? Why not his fellow Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner? After all, no senator was more passionately devoted to the cause of emancipation than Charles Sumner. And there are few individuals in Senate history that I admire more than Charles Sumner. He was brilliant, eccentric, studious, arrogant, irritating, and absolutely committed to racial equality. He arrived on the scene like a violent thunderstorm in 1851, and on his deathbed in 1874, he was pleading for passage of his enlightened Civil Rights Bill. No senator could match Sumner for inflammatory speeches. One of them got him beaten famously in the Senate chamber. But his impassioned efforts often failed to become legislation. Sumner was an agitator. Wilson was a legislator. They were close friends, they were associates, but when it comes to effective leadership, I give the nod to Wilson, and here's why. Wilson was a member of the Radical Republicans, members of Congress who led the Union effort during the war and championed the rights of freedmen. But he was also a pragmatist. One biographer labeled him the practical radical, and I think that's a pretty good label. While Sumner agitated for complete emancipation, refusing to accept anything less, Wilson steadily worked to loosen the grip of this most horrific of institutions. As one historian wrote, Wilson was prepared to move in a cautious yet determined fashion to strike at slavery wherever he found the opportunity. That opportunity came in Washington, D.C. Soon after Congress convened in December of 1861, so in the early days of the war, Wilson called for emancipation of slaves in Washington, D.C. through a policy of compensation. Now, the idea of compensating slave owners was not a new idea. Abraham Lincoln had proposed the idea when he was in the House in 1849. With Wilson's plan, written in collaboration with Judge Thomas Marshall Key, slave owners loyal to the Union would free slaves and be compensated up to $300 per person. The plan met with fierce opposition. Most Union supporters had not yet prioritized emancipation, and they worried about alienating borderline states. Even district officials, including the Board of Aldermen, were not in favor of emancipation. Extremists like Sumner openly rejected the idea of compensation, arguing that payment provided recognition of the right to hold human beings as property. And all of that is perfectly justified. But Henry Wilson, the practical radical, was willing to compensate slave owners if that resulted in the freedom of the more than 3,000 enslaved men and women who lived in Washington, D.C. It took 4 months of debate and countless speeches and arguments, but Wilson won that fight. The Senate passed the bill on April 3rd, 1862. The House followed suit 8 days later, and on April 16th, a date that's now observed as Emancipation Day in Washington, D.C., President Lincoln signed it into law. Henry Wilson had successfully passed the nation's first practical act of emancipation. The implications were profound, as this became the first step in a wider legislative war on slavery. If Wilson could not take 2 steps forward, commented one of his colleagues, he would take 1 and bide his time for further advance. To those who criticized his incremental approach, Wilson replied, "It is sound policy to strike at this system of slavery whenever and wherever you can get a blow at it." Wilson was, in modern terms, the master of the art of the possible. Throughout the Civil War, he continued to champion the rights of African Americans. He supported black soldiers, proposing bills to allow them to serve in the Union Army, to provide them with equal pay, to give them the benefits enjoyed by white soldiers. He sought ways to provide equal opportunity in education to black children. Some legislative battles he won, others he lost, but he never stopped trying. When the war ended, he was among the first to propose a new civil rights bill to guarantee citizenship rights to the formerly enslaved population, setting the foundation for the 14th Amendment. In 1873, as a reward for his service, he became Ulysses Grant's vice president. But he suffered a stroke just 2 months into his service and never regained good health. He died in the vice president's office in the Capitol building on November 22nd, 1875. Now, by any standard, Wilson's career was remarkable. So why is he forgotten? Well, when you're preceded by Daniel Webster and you serve alongside Charles Sumner, your fame is liable to be fleeting, and his was. But he left an important legacy. Fiery speeches are important, but getting the job done is a real sign of leadership. And so is courage. It takes courage to be a statesman. Except it's a woman. Can she be a statesman? Clearly, it's time to rethink our terminology. Margaret Chase Smith of Maine. When people keep telling you that you can't do a thing, Senator Smith once said, you kind of want to try it. Now, John will tell you that Margaret Chase Smith is one of my favorite senators, and I could talk about her all night and never run out of material, but I'll try to keep some discipline here and stick to the topic. In 1948, Margaret Chase Smith decided to try for a seat in the U.S. Senate. She had already completed 4 terms in the House of Representatives, but many thought this woman from the state of Maine was being too ambitious. The little lady is simply overreaching herself in trying for a Senate seat, wrote one reporter. She has stepped out of her class, commented another. Well, Smith won that election and began her 24-year Senate career on January 3rd, 1949. The first woman to serve in both houses of Congress, Smith was a pioneer who defied societal expectations and blazed a trail for women. For 15 of her 24 years in the Senate, she was the only female senator. Now, that alone took some courage. But early in her first term, she demonstrated just how gutsy she really was. On February 9th, 1950, the junior senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, proclaimed, "I have in my hand a list of 205 names of communists in the U.S. government." The number changed from day to day, but it was something like that. That speech began the era we now call McCarthyism. Joe McCarthy played on people's fears to stir up concerns about foreign intrusion into American government, society, and politics. Almost overnight, he became a media sensation. As his popularity grew, his charges became ever more reckless. At first, Margaret Chase Smith was impressed with McCarthy's accusations. She was a dedicated anti-communist and had grave concerns about the growing influence of the Soviet Union. As McCarthy's allegations multiplied, however, Smith demanded to see evidence. Of course, McCarthy produced no evidence. It was then, Smith recalled, that I began to wonder about the validity and fairness of Joseph McCarthy's charges. As McCarthy grabbed headlines, few senators dared to challenge him. Maryland Senator Millard Tydings led an investigation into the accusations, and New Mexico Senator Dennis Chavez expressed concerns about the growing paranoia, but they were both Democrats. McCarthy was a Republican. Therefore, their criticism could be dismissed on partisan grounds. Margaret Chase Smith, on the other hand, was a strong and loyal Republican. But Smith also hesitated to speak. I was a freshman senator, she remembered. And in those days, freshman senators were to be seen and not heard. Smith hoped a senior member would take the lead, but that didn't happen. She also hoped the Republican leadership would take the lead, and that also didn't happen. This great psychological fear spread to the Senate, she noted, where a considerable amount of mental paralysis and muteness set in for fear of offending Joe McCarthy. As McCarthy continued to ignore her demands for evidence, Margaret Chase Smith decided to take action. On June 1st, 1950, Senator Smith boarded the Senate subway to take her from the Senate office building to the Capitol building. And on that morning, there was a fateful encounter. And this is one of those great dramatic moments in Senate history that you just can't make up. Boarding the tram, Smith encountered Joe McCarthy. Margaret, he said in his usual condescending manner, you look very serious. Are you going to give a speech? Without hesitation, Smith replied, yes, and you will not like it. Entering the Senate chamber, Smith took her seat. She noted that her hand trembled a bit. This was a big moment for a junior senator. She sat through routine, through routine morning business, then listened to an exchange between McCarthy and California Senator William Nolan. Finally, she stood and asked for recognition. Just a few rows behind her sat Joe McCarthy. Mr. President, she began, I would like to speak briefly and simply about a serious national condition. It is a national feeling of fear and frustration that could result in the end of everything that we Americans hold dear. Excuse me. As she continued, her hand steadied and her voice got stronger. Mr. President, I speak as a Republican. I speak as a woman. I speak as a United States Senator. I speak as an American. The United States Senate has long enjoyed worldwide respect as the greatest deliberative body. But recently, that deliberative character has been debased to a form of hate and character assassination. I think it is high time for the United States Senate and its members to do some real soul searching. As she continued, a few other senators came into the chamber and took their seat. Those of us who shout the loudest about Americanism and making character assassinations are all too frequently those who, by our own words and acts, ignore some of the basic principles of Americanism: the right to criticize, the right to hold unpopular beliefs, the right to protest, the right of independent thought. Looking ahead to the fall elections, Smith expressed her hope for a Republican victory, but stated that such a victory must come through political integrity, not through baseless charges and dishonest campaigns. I do not want to see the Republican Party ride to political victory on the four horsemen of calumny: fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear. With that, Smith submitted for the record a brief statement of principles endorsed by 6 other Republicans. She called it her Declaration of Conscience. Throughout the speech, Smith never mentioned McCarthy's name, but everyone knew who the target was. The speech triggered an explosion of media support and criticism. This cool breeze of honesty from Maine can blow the whole miasma out of the nation's soul, noted one reporter. By one act of political courage, Smith has justified a lifetime in politics, stated another. Critics called her un-American, Moscow-loving, and a whole lot worse. Not surprisingly, McCarthy counterattacked the senators who opposed him. Millard Tydings, for example, the 23-year veteran who led that initial investigation, fell victim to a McCarthy-led smear campaign in the fall that denied him re-election to another term. This put senators on notice. You support McCarthy or face possible defeat at the polls. Smith was not up for re-election in 1950, but in what was labeled a political spanking, she was denied important committee assignments and endured repeated public attacks by McCarthy and his allies. But she never gave up. In one exchange in 1951, McCarthy dismissed her as a mental midget, prompting Smith to reply, "I shall not permit intimidation to keep me from expressing my honest opinions." "There's too many damn women in the Senate," he cried at another time, which I think is a particularly telling statement because she was the only woman in the Senate. The real battle came in 1954, when Smith faced re-election for a second term. McCarthy handpicked a candidate to challenge her in the Republican primary. He funneled large amounts of money into that campaign, and then he launched a speaking tour across the state to do everything he could to get her defeated. But his efforts failed. Smith's support among Maine voters, added to McCarthy's slump in public opinion after the Army McCarthy hearings of that year, earned her an easy victory in the June 21st primary, and an even easier win in the fall election. Smith's victory proved to be an important nail in McCarthy's political coffin. His ability to silence his critics had been his primary source of power, but the critic he had tried hardest to defeat had won a major victory, beating his hand-picked candidate by a 5-to-1 margin. Margaret Chase Smith's stunning victory proved decisively that senators could oppose Joe McCarthy and still get elected. As one contemporary noted, if a mere woman could beat Joe McCarthy by a 5-to-1 margin, then why should men senators fear to oppose him? Opposition to McCarthyism was no longer political suicide. Barely a month later, Vermont Senator Ralph Flanders introduced a resolution to censure Joe McCarthy. In December of 1954, the Senate finally concurred with the little lady from Maine and condemned McCarthy for conduct contrary to senatorial traditions. That is a very Senate thing to do. McCarthy served another 3 years until his death in 1957, but his career was over. He was ostracized by the Senate and all but powerless at this point. During those waning days of McCarthyism, there was another fateful meeting on the Senate subway. McCarthy again boarded the tram, took a seat next to Margaret Chase Smith. Excuse me. "Margaret, we seem to always be riding together," he said. "Yes," Smith replied, "and if you don't watch out, Joe, people will say that we are fellow travelers." "I never walk out on a vote or dodge an issue," Smith once declared. "I am always willing to stand up and be counted no matter how controversial the issue." Never was that more true than in her courageous stand against McCarthyism. I've been talking all day. You have to put up with my water. If the Senate ever needed courageous leaders, it was in the 1960s, when it faced the daunting task of passing civil rights legislation. This brings me to my next set of criteria for effective leadership: the importance of compromise and the ability to build strong, supportive coalitions. For a century, the Senate had been the primary obstacle to every civil rights bill, including scores of anti-lynching bills that either died in committee or were defeated by filibuster. When a civil rights bill did manage to squeak through, as one did in 1957 and another in 1960, it was so diluted by amendments that it lost all effect. But in 1964, A determined team of Senate leaders, and in this case they were formal Senate leaders, decided it was time for change. On February 17, 1964, Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield, a quiet, unassuming man from Montana, announced the arrival of H.R. 7152, the landmark civil rights bill that had just passed the House. Mansfield understood that this bill would have to clear major hurdles before it could pass and become law, including the hurdle of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Chaired by James Eastland of Mississippi, the Judiciary Committee was known as the graveyard of civil rights bills. Bill after bill after bill had died in that committee without a single day of debate by the full Senate. The only way around this was to avoid the committee and bring the bill straight to the floor for debate. We now call that pulling a Rule 14. To do that, Mansfield introduced a motion to proceed, signaling to everyone that he was very serious about this bill. That action also alerted the opposition, led by Georgia Senator Richard Russell, who was a master of the filibuster. Battle lines were drawn. Mansfield had taken control of the pro-civil rights forces, while Russell stood firm as leader of the Southern segregationists. Now, here's an important point to remember. Mansfield and Russell were of the same political party. They were both Democrats. Today, we are used to seeing the Senate divided on party lines. Nearly every bill becomes Democrats versus Republicans. The Senate of the 1960s was very different. The two parties were internally divided. Democrats were split into groups of Northern liberals and Southern conservatives. The Republican Party had a liberal, a moderate, and a conservative wing. To pass a civil rights bill, Senate leaders had to build from those factions a coalition that would become a strong bipartisan base of support. And to do that, Mansfield enlisted the support of the minority leader, Republican leader, Everett Dirksen of Illinois. These two leaders, in turn, called upon their trusted deputies, party whips Hubert Humphrey, Democrat of Minnesota, and Thomas Kuchel, Republican from California, to serve as the floor managers for the bill. With the team assembled, Mansfield defined his strategy. To overcome the inevitable filibusters and to gain passage of the bill, they needed the votes to invoke cloture, first on the motion to proceed and then on the bill itself. It was an ambitious strategy. At that time, Senate Rule 22, that's the cloture rule, required the support of 67 senators, 2/3 of the Senate, to invoke cloture and end a filibuster. Since the cloture rule had been adopted in 1917, the Senate had successfully invoked cloture only 5 times, and never on a civil rights bill. With that challenge in mind, on March 9, 1964, Mansfield introduced his motion to bypass committee and make the civil rights bill the Senate's pending business. As expected, Russell and his Southern allies launched the filibuster. But they were holding their best ammunition for the bigger fight to come. The first filibuster ended on March 26, when the cloture motion squeaked through on a vote of 67 to 17. With his segregationist colleagues standing firmly behind him, Russell announced, "We shall now begin to fight this war." Full debate on the bill began, and so did another filibuster. Southern senators had perfected their tactics over the years, coordinating speeches and colloquies on the Senate floor that could last for days, even weeks if necessary. This filibuster lasted for nearly 3 months. But Hubert Humphrey and Thomas Kuchel were also experts in Senate rules and procedures, and they also knew how to mobilize support. Throughout the spring of 1964, the two party whips organized regular bipartisan meetings. Senators, civil rights activists, NAACP leaders, the attorneys from the Justice Department all joined in the meetings. They also launched a massive educational campaign, carefully selecting bipartisan teams of senators and staff to manage each of the bill's 11 titles. They drafted daily newsletters, did press interviews, and held forums, all to shape public opinion. For the first time in Senate history, the pro-civil rights forces were just as organized as the segregationists. As the two bill managers counted heads, however, they were coming up short for cloture. How to get to that magic number of 67? A third of the Democratic caucus supported the filibuster, so the decisive votes had to come from the Republicans. They needed Everett Dirksen. Dirksen supported the bill, but his position as Republican leader created a dilemma for this Illinois senator. 1964 was a presidential election year. Even as this debate continued in the Senate, primaries were underway to decide which Republican candidate would face off against Lyndon Johnson in the fall. Minority Leader Dirksen was being asked to deliver Republican votes to support a bill championed by a Democratic president. Many argued that the last thing the Senate Republican leader should be doing was to provide a Democratic administration with a major legislative victory. But Dirksen, a proud Republican from this land of Lincoln, was determined to preserve the legacy of the great emancipator. As the bipartisan team continued its work, therefore, Dirksen began tinkering with the bill. Over the next 3 months, the Republican leader suggested a host of amendments to find compromise among competing factions. In early April, Dirksen attended the Republicans' weekly policy luncheon and presented a set of 40 draft amendments. Conservative Republicans, suspicious of the leader's deal-making, were reluctant to sign on. Liberal Republicans who supported the bill complained that Dirksen had amended too much. As the debate continued, Dirksen studied, researched, and produced amendments while constantly testing the water, looking for support. Details were discussed, agreements were made, and deals were struck as he collected Republican votes for cloture. It was a legislative dance designed to maintain majority support while adapting where necessary to get minority support. Finally, on May 13th, the end appeared to be in sight. There comes a moment, Dirksen remarked, when there's a feeling in the air that the time has come for action, and we're just about there. Dirksen formally endorsed the amended bill. It became known as Dirksen's bill, but it was the carefully crafted product of months of bipartisan cooperation. In mid-May, both party caucuses began discussing Dirksen's revised bill. Meeting with Republicans, Dirksen carefully read through the bill title by title, explaining each and every change. These were not placid meetings. As one historian noted, the room was often filled with a cacophony of voices, raising questions, objections, and doubts. But in the end, Dirksen believed he had the support he needed. On May 26th, Republican leader Everett Dirksen, with Democratic leader Mike Mansfield standing by his side, introduced the revised version of H.R. 7152. We have now reached the point where there must be action, Dirksen announced. But the filibuster continued. Could they break it? Could they reach 67? At best, Mansfield and Humphrey hoped to get 42 Democrats to vote for the bill. This meant that Dirksen had to deliver at least 25 of his 33-member caucus. Optimistically, Mansfield announced that cloture would be attempted during the first week of June. You have to hit bedrock sometime, he said. But that optimism didn't last long. Opposition rose within the Republican ranks when Senator Burt Hickenlooper, chair of the Republican Policy Committee, criticized Dirksen's closed-door negotiations. To make matters worse, Dirksen fell ill with a serious chest cold. While he was recuperating at home, Hickenlooper worked to sway Republican votes against the bill. By the time Dirksen returned to work on June 5th, his carefully built Republican coalition was in shambles. Mansfield was forced to postpone the cloture vote to let Dirksen repair the damage. 3 days later, Mansfield announced that the vote on cloture would take place at 10 a.m. on Wednesday, June 10th. As the clock ticked away, the filibuster dragged on. At 7:38 p.m. on June 9th, West Virginia Senator Robert C. Byrd took the floor. He had in his hand an 800-page speech laying out all the reasons why the Senate should not invoke cloture on the Civil Rights Bill. He spoke for 14 hours and 13 minutes. Reporters called it the last gasp of the Southern filibuster. As the 10 o'clock hour approached on June 10th, Byrd yielded the floor for the scheduled cloture vote. June 10th, 1964, probably one of the most dramatic days in Senate history. Silently, senators sat at their desks. Former senators, House members, and other guests squeezed into the back of the chamber where visitors were allowed. Visitors packed the galleries. Outside the Capitol, queued among the news cameras and microphones in those days before C-SPAN, hundreds more gathered, hoping for news of the dramatic proceedings inside the chamber. Mansfield, Dirksen, Humphrey, and Kuechel believed they had secured the 67 votes they needed to invoke cloture. Others remained skeptical. Only the roll call vote would tell the truth. Mr. President, Mansfield began, the Senate now stands at the crossroads of history, and the time for decision is at hand. Other speeches followed, then Mansfield turned it over to Dirksen. Briefly summarizing the compromise bill they'd worked so hard to produce, Dirksen spoke with his customary eloquence. America grows, he stated quietly, America changes, and on the civil rights issue, we must rise to the occasion. That calls for cloture and the enactment of the Civil Rights Bill. To conclude, Dirksen proclaimed in words that echoed Victor Hugo, stronger than all the armies is an idea whose time has come. It will not be stayed or denied, it is here. The presiding officer ordered the secretary to call the roll. Mr. Aiken, aye. Mr. Allett, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. And it began. The roll call vote on perhaps the most consequential cloture motion of Senate history. As the names were called, members and visitors alike listened with bated breath. Mr. Church, aye. Mr. Clark, aye. Mr. Eastland, no. When the secretary reached Mr. Engel, there was no response. California Senator Claire Engel was present in the chamber, but a brain tumor had robbed the Democratic senator of his ability to speak. Instead, the dying senator raised his unsteady hand and pointed to his eye to signify his aye vote. Few witnesses ever forgot that poignant moment. Mr. Randolph, aye. Mr. Ribicoff, aye. Mr. Russell, no. With each response, the secretary marked off the tally sheet. All around the chamber, senators kept their own sheets, simply checking names and numbers, waiting for the magic 67. Mr. Thurmond, no. Mr. Walters, no. Mr. Williams, aye. That's it, quietly exclaimed Mike Mansfield. That was a big outbreak for Mansfield. It was Delaware's John Williams. The 96th vote name to be called became the 67th vote. With 6 wavering senators providing a 4-vote margin of victory, the final tally stood at 71 to 29. 27 Republicans and 44 Democrats joined forces to move this bill forward. Proponents of the Civil Rights Bill had won. Immediately, Southerners began a post-cloture fight and new opposition amendments appeared designed to block or weaken the bill, but the Senate leaders stood guard, pushing back all efforts to undermine the bill. Finally, on June 19th, the Senate voted one last time on the Civil Rights Bill. By comparison to the cloture vote, the final passage was anticlimactic, but it marked a new era in American history and a transitional moment in Senate history. At 7:40 p.m. on June 19th, 1964, the Senate passed the Civil Rights Bill. On July 2nd, the House approved the Senate bill, and that evening, President Lyndon Johnson signed it into law. As Dirksen had predicted, its time had come. That was statesmanship. Each of these leaders, Mansfield, Dirksen, Humphrey, and Kuechel, were willing to listen, willing to compromise in order to achieve this very elusive goal. Humphrey, Kuechel, and others who worked so hard to get the bill passed did not fear a lengthy debate. In fact, they welcomed it. They even welcomed the filibuster. They believed that only through a lengthy, robust, and diligent debate process could they produce a successful bill. Opponents also welcomed the debate. In the wake of final passage, Richard Russell praised Senate leaders for allowing the full debate. By giving the opposition a chance to speak, he said, Mansfield and Dirksen ultimately made the bill enforceable in southern states. And they were open to compromise. Mansfield steered the bill away from the Judiciary Committee to save it from certain death, but this deft maneuver did nothing to curtail amendments. From March to June of 1964, the Senate considered literally hundreds of amendments to this bill. Some passed, others didn't. Dirksen's amendments ultimately made the bill passable. Mike Mansfield succeeded in doing what many other leaders had failed to do, to skillfully build the bipartisan coalition needed to pass this monumental piece of legislation. Mansfield and Humphrey were a powerful Democratic team, but this success could not have come without the equally dedicated work of Republicans Everett Dirksen and Tommy Kiko, and countless others that I've not mentioned today. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not a Democratic victory, nor a Republican victory. It was an American victory. Its success was due entirely to the bipartisan collaboration of these four statesmen. Defining leadership, looking for statesmen and stateswomen, is not about hero worship or an exercise in hagiography. None of the individuals that I've mentioned ever attained perfection, nor were they leaders in every cause. But in each of these cases, they met that challenge. Aristotle equated statesmanship with prudence and practical wisdom. Edmund Burke said it was a disposition to preserve and an ability to improve. John Adams characteristically said that a statesman will not make his own fortune, but he would certainly make the fortune of his country. I would add to those the importance of honesty, the desire to collaborate, a respect for opposing views, and the understanding that something is almost always better than nothing. Henry Wilson embraced the cause of freedom and then found a way to make it a legislative reality. Margaret Chase Smith stood up for honesty and spoke against tyranny and ultimately empowered others to do the same. Mansfield and Dirksen reminded us that the greatest legislative victories do not belong to any individual or any political party, but to the nation. Reminding us of that fact should be a continuing responsibility for any Senate leader. Thank you. Thank you very much. If you have questions, comments, rants, speeches, I'd love to hear them. Yes, way back there. Speak up loud, and they have some microphones they're coming around with, too.
I enjoyed hearing about the traditions of the Senate and the qualities of character. This, I think, is very important to us. May I amend your motion? I think that the most effective leader, without a lot of character qualities, was Lyndon Baines Johnson. I think that he is the key, first of all, to breaking the Southern bloc in 1957. He was the majority leader, and he broke the bloc. They always gathered together. He was he was Richard Russell's best friend, as well as the senator from Sam Ervin. But he's the one who got that done, and so did Eisenhower support him. Likewise, he's the one who was never used in Kennedy's administration to work on legislation when he was the champion of it. And after Kennedy's assassination, Johnson wanted this passed and spoke to it. I think Johnson is the one who is really the effective person there.
I don't disagree with that. There were really important leaders in the House. Johnson was an important leader in the White House. But the subject of my topic is about Senate leadership, not presidential leadership.
I was pleased at age 18 to go to the Republican National Convention in 1972. I bumped into senators and sat every day with a senator from Kentucky. His name was John Sherman Cooper. He had voted for the legislation as a Republican. Both Republicans in Kentucky had voted for the legislation. And it was interesting for me to find out that a higher proportion of Republicans Democrats voted for it. But that's because, as you mentioned, because of the Southern Democrats.
Yes, because,
I appreciate your thought.
and because of the Southern Democrats that were so locked into that block, but also because the Republicans had a much smaller caucus to draw from as well. So, yeah. Over here. We'll keep the microphones running here.
Thank you for the presentation. And for my high school teacher, I remember the great term that you put up for Webster and Clayton Calhoun. My question is a little bit more technical because I saw some of the footnotes in your presentation. What is the job description of a Senate historian? But what about the archival materials that you have access to? Because I noticed there are different offices. And is there a formal history of the Senate as an institution
Okay.
versus this very informative lecture you just given on the
Okay.
personalities that made the Senate?
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, good questions. As director of the Senate Historical Office, I oversee both the historical aspects and the archival aspects of the office. And when our office was founded in 1975, it was founded by Mike Mansfield with the mission to preserve and promote Senate history. And the preserving part was to make sure that Senate records, and there are official Senate records like committee records and that type of stuff that get archived at the National Archives. So we make sure that all those records are properly preserved and transferred to the archives on a regular basis. And then there are senators' papers, which are private papers, but we also work very closely with all the senators to be sure that their records are also preserved and are preserved at places like SIU and other state repositories. And we take that mission very seriously, and I have 3 archivists on my staff that oversee that and do the hands-on work while I sort of supervise, if you call it that. And we also work very closely with congressional centers like the Paul Simon Center, like the Dirksen Center in Illinois, and places like that to help them to promote Senate history as well. So that's part of the mission of our office, and both of those are included in the Senate Historical Office's mission. It's hard to describe like a typical day in the life of the Senate historian because they vary so much from day to day. I mean, most importantly, I am there to be institutional memory for the Senate. So I am there to provide the historical information that senators need at any given time, but I also work a lot with the press. I work with school groups and visitors and this kind of stuff. We do presentations and talks and publications all year long. And, but the core of it is to be that institutional memory. And that means that we are often working with committee staffs and that type of thing. But it's so varied and it covers so much ground, it's kind of hard to describe in one quick little easy summary. But it's a never boring, always changing workload that I come in and work in the morning and I'm never quite sure what I'm going to be working on that day because I'll be hoping I'm going to work on this project, and then the phone rings and something's happened on the floor of the Senate, somebody has said something or done something, and then everybody wants to know, has that ever happened before? Is there consequences to him saying that? You know, that kind of stuff. And so we just get peppered with that kind of stuff all day long. Now, institutional history of the Senate, we are the sources of the institutional history. And really, probably the most comprehensive source you would find on that would be on the Senate website. We have about 10,000 pages of historical material on the Senate website in the history section. And that's where you're going to get the best institutional history of the Senate. And we are currently working on a new web feature that is going to be really geared towards exactly that, so that people can go there and get sort of like a textbook institutional history of the Senate. There's no one book that captures all that. The Senate's been around for 230 years and has had 1,983 members, so it's a pretty complex story. And there are books I could recommend about certain people or certain time periods and that kind of stuff, but it's really hard to come up with one single book that just sort of captures all of that story. So, yeah, Joe.
Okay, so you talked about how formal Senate leadership doesn't always necessarily mean Senate leadership as a whole. More often than not, do you find that formal Senate leadership
lot of times we've had leaders like Mansfield and stuff who are really strong leaders and really become institutional leaders. I think really throughout history, Senate history, most often the leadership has really come from other senators. You know, party leaders are very involved in the intricacies of their job, managing legislation on the floor, thinking about the calendar and when bills are going to be called up and this kind of stuff, dealing with the White House, dealing with the House of Representatives. Often it's the rank and file leaders, the rank and file members that produce the leaders that come forward on particular issues. You know, people that really step forward to take a strong interest in a certain legislative agenda or something like that. That's where I really see the effective leadership. I think that we certainly have had majority, minority leaders that have been great leaders through the years. We've had great partnerships of leaders. Mansfield and Dirksen are a good example of that. But I think usually they're really caught up in the party aspects of it all, and it's often the other senators that come forward and become leaders in causes. And through personal experience, they may, you know, I'm thinking about, for instance, like Tom Harkin of Iowa and the Americans with Disabilities Act, for instance. That was a very personal story for him because he had family members who were disabled, and he just dedicated so much time and effort to that. So he truly became the leader in that particular legislature, working very closely with Bob Dole on the other side, both of whom had very personal experiences. And that's often the way it is. It's something that's really hits home to them. And that's usually where the most effective leadership comes from. It's often quiet, it's often under the radar, so you don't necessarily see a lot of press coverage of it, but they're the ones that are just behind the scenes working away at those important issues. Thanks, Joe. Yeah.
The Senate used to be known as a collegial institution. What happened to the collegiality?
Good question. It's not very collegial right now. They do a lot of fighting right now. Although I will say that, again, when you get out of the view of the cameras and the press, and you're sitting in committee hearings and things like that, you still see a lot of collegiality. I still see a lot of bipartisan conversations. I see a lot of bipartisan friendships in the Senate still. But to explain how we got to this place, and I should also say we've had many times in the past when the Senate's been very divided. Now, it hasn't always been divided on party lines. That's kind of a modern phenomenon, but we certainly have had times when they've been divided on other issues and regional divisions and ideological divisions. I think, though, that there's a lot of factors that have gone in to bring us to where we are today. And part of it's the party developments and the ways that that's gone through the years. But the institution of the Senate has changed in ways, too. The schedule has gotten shrunk down to a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in Washington schedule. And then the members all fly home on the weekends. So back at this era in the 1960s or the 1980s, even to the 1990s, senators would come to Washington, they'd bring their families with them, they'd establish homes there, and they would be in Washington pretty much all the time. They'd only go home sometimes 3, 4, 5 times a year maybe. And so not only were they there 5 days a week working with each other, they went to dinner parties on weekends and had barbecues and things like that. And so they had a chance to get to know each other and to form strong friendships. And through the years, that system has changed, and there's lots of reasons for that. One is the role of women, because we got to the point in the 1970s and 80s where the wives of senators didn't want to be just uprooted and brought to Washington. They had careers of their own. They had agendas of their own. And so you get this sort of split family process going where members have to commute home every weekend to see their families. And also, we had a kind of a revolt among young senators in the 1990s who wanted a different schedule. They wanted this condensed schedule so that they could go home to be with their families, whereas the older senators were kind of used to the old system and they wanted to have a Monday, Friday in Washington work week. So now they have the demands of fundraising and all these things that are pulling them in lots of different directions. And the end result of all of that, to simplify, is that they're in Washington for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and most of the time they're there, they're in party-led meetings, luncheons, that kind of stuff. And they have relatively few opportunities to just sit down and talk to each other, to get to know each other, to listen to opposing views, to compromise on issues. And it's made it a much more difficult process to be a collegial body like it used to be. There are lots of people in the Senate, including senators, who are often talk about how to get back to that. You know, and one of the things they say is somehow we have to deal with the money issue, but we also have to deal with the scheduling issue so that they have time to sit down and talk to each other and get to know each other. And it's one answer to your question. That's a very complicated question, actually. But there are lots of things that have happened that have led the modern Senate to where it is now, and it makes it hard to have that kind of collegiality that we had 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Yeah. Over here.
Can you characterize the differences between the Senate when it was basically, the senators were appointed by the states, as now after the amendment that requires a direct election senator?
Yeah, senators were never appointed by the states. They were elected by state legislatures. And there's a slight difference in there. But up until 1913, constitutionally, senators were elected by state legislatures. And when the framers wrote that into the Constitution, they had in mind a lot of various factors about the Senate that they wanted to distinguish from the House. And one is that they wanted to give senators distance from the people, distance from the electorate. They didn't want them to face the sort of pressures of public opinion. That was all for the House. That was designed for the House. And so they created this indirect election system where state legislatures would elect the senator and send them to Washington. And that worked well for a while. In the post-Civil War era, it really started to break down, partly because in the wake of the Civil War, as states went back to business in the post-war era, there was a lot of division and partisanships at the state legislature, and they had a hard time deciding on which two senators to send, and sometimes they would send competing pairs and this kind of stuff. It sometimes resulted in vacancies in the Senate. I think it was Delaware that had two vacant Senate seats for 4 years because the state legislature could not decide who to send there. It also got kind of caught up in the corruption of the Gilded Age, and so by the time to get to the turn of the century, there's a really strong call to amend the Constitution to allow for the direct popular election of senators. And the efforts to do that really start in the West, in Oregon, and some of the new states coming into the Union where they create their own system of direct popular election. Oregon had this great plan that they essentially said that state legislatures had to agree to send to Washington the senators that were chosen by a popular election at state level. And if the state legislature chose not to listen to their opinion and send that particular senator, they'd be thrown out of office. That was essentially it. So they kind of had a choice. They could do a direct election or be thrown out of office. And then the trend moved towards the east. And there were a variety of factors in the early 20th century that really pushed that, including the fact that more and more senators were coming in through these state-based systems and had a connection to a direct election system. So in 1913, they passed the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which puts in the direct popular election of U.S. senators. In the immediate aftermath of that, you don't see a lot of change in the Senate because it takes time for things to get mobilized. And so for the first 1914 is the first election where all senators up for election faced direct election. And all of the incumbents got elected back to office. So it wasn't as if they just turned everybody out now that people had the vote. But when you get to 1916 and 1918, and as time is for people to mobilize and get that system going, you start to see more turnover in the Senate. You start to see some of the impact of that. Now, in the long view, it changed that one part of the constitutional design of the Senate, but it didn't change other things. And so all the rest of the Senate, the advice and consent powers and all this stuff, all remained intact. So it changed how they get elected, but it didn't necessarily change the responsibilities that they have or the duties they have. Now, the one thing it really did change in a very big way is that senators had to start campaigning for office. And that meant they had to raise money for campaigns. And so by the time you get to the 1920s, the Senate is starting to hold investigations into the corruption of money in politics and this kind of stuff. And so it has that tremendous impact that way. So, you know, you would find Senate scholars who would argue both sides of this case. I have colleagues that would say it had no impact at all on the Senate. I actually think it had a pretty broad impact on the Senate in terms of who gets elected by 1920, 1922, that time, but particularly because senators suddenly had to face the electorate face on and go out and campaign for office. And it's kind of like when women get the vote in 1920, and some historians have said, well, you know, it wasn't as if all of a sudden we have all these women show up in Congress the next year. We get the first woman comes to the Senate in 1922. She's appointed to fill a vacancy. And it takes another 10 years to get the next one. So it's not like they're flooding into the Senate. But the reality is when you look at it, 1920, 21, 22, 24, 26, women are running for political office in record numbers. They just aren't getting elected because they don't yet have the power, the money, and the mobilization to make that happen. And that's kind of true with the direct election story too. Yeah. Any other questions, comments?
Since the Senate provides equal representation to states rather than to population or to individual citizens, do you think that has had a difference, has made a difference in terms of how the Senate functions relative to the House of Representatives who the office?
Undoubtedly.
You know, kind of what can you say about that?
In the Senate, every state has an equal voice. Every senator has an equal voice. I think that's had a profound impact on the way the Senate operates. And I personally think a profound and positive aspect on the way the Senate. It's not meant to be a democratic institution like the House. It was meant to be different. And I think the fact that, you know, Vermont has the same power in the Senate as California or New York is actually really important, because somewhere in the federal government, you have to have a place where the minority has a voice. Whether that be a minority of population, a minority of women or African Americans, or whether it's a minority of a small state versus a large state, you have to have somewhere where the minority has a voice. And that's all, for the Senate, much of that goes back to that very decision made by the framers back in 1787 to give that equal voice to the Senate. And it also means that in the Senate, every single individual is important. And I think as a Senate historian, that's one of the most important characteristics of the Senate. Because every senator can have the same amount of time, power, votes, whatever the case may be, as everybody else. Whether you're, regardless of where you're from, whether you're male or female, whatever the case may be, it empowers individual action. And so Senate history is really all about the story of individuals who have taken action for whatever purpose. And they can't do that in the House. It's a different environment. It's the voice of one has a really hard time being heard in the House. In the Senate, every voice gets heard. And I think that's profoundly important to the Senate and its role in our government. One last question, over here.
Thank you, and thank you so much for your talk. I'm one of the law professors here at the law school. As I was listening to your presentation, I realized how difficult it must be to select which of the three you had to pick and how important it was to be balanced. So within your role in the office, how do you ensure, or the structure of the office ensure its integrity and independence? Because I'm quite sure there are parties and members of the Senate who want a particular stamp on their legacy.
Well, we are strictly nonpartisan in our office. That's the nature of our business. And I'm happy to say I have never had a senator try to stamp our office in a partisan way. I am happy to say that the Senate respects our office. Senators respect our office and the work we do. I have never, in 22 years, I've never had a senator try to influence what I say or the outcome of what I'm writing or anything. Even when I meet with groups of Republican senators, I meet groups of Democratic senators, I go into those, with a talk that you could give to either side. I try to be nonpartisan. I've never, ever had a senator say to me, that was unbalanced or biased, or I think you need to spin it this way or spin it that way. It's never happened. So I'm not sure what we're doing to make that happen, but so far that's been the case. If that happens tomorrow, then I may have to think about that question. But so far, we've been very fortunate, and just they've never tried to influence our work. Yeah. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it very much.